Your horse screams beneath you, fighting the reins with a terror you've never felt from it before. It smells the truth of this valley long before your mind can accept what your eyes are seeing. You are one of Sultan Mehmed's elite scouts, a conqueror of Constantinople, a man who thought he had witnessed every horror war could offer. You were wrong. Before you, stretching for miles under the June sun, is not an army. It is a forest of 20,000 stakes, each bearing a rotting corpse, men, women, and children. The air is a thick, unbreathable mix of decay and unnatural silence. This isn't a battlefield. It's a masterpiece of terror, a message designed to break an empire's will. And as you stare into this grotesque orchard, you know with chilling certainty that only one man could plant such a garden of death. A man whose name is a curse whispered in the dark. Dracula. How could any man conceive of such a thing? How did we arrive at this field of nightmares? This story doesn't start here. It starts with a boy, and a name that would echo through history, like a curse whispered in the dark. For Vlad, born in 1431, his very name was a prophecy, a dual legacy hanging over him from his first breath. His father, Vlad II, bore the title Drakel, member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian military order sworn to defend Europe against the Ottoman Empire. But Drakel also meant devil in the local tongue, and for young Vlad, that darker interpretation would prove prophetic. The boy's education in terror began early. At age 11, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were handed over to the Ottoman Sultan as political hostages, human insurance policies to guarantee their father's loyalty. While most children that age were playing games, Vlad was learning the brutal mathematics of power in the Sultan's court. The Ottoman palace wasn't just a seat of government, it was a finishing school for future rulers, a place where political cunning was sharpened like a blade. But Vlad proved to be a difficult student. Where other hostage princes learned to bow and scrape, Vlad seethed with barely contained fury. Every lesson in submission became fuel for his growing hatred. His younger brother Radu took a different path. Charming and adaptable, Radu found ways to thrive in captivity, even earning the Sultan's favor. But Vlad found only reasons to hate. The Ottomans saw his defiance and responded with characteristic brutality. Every lash across his back, every humiliation heaped upon him, was a lesson etched into his soul, not in submission, but in the art of revenge. The breaking point came in 1447. News arrived that would reshape Vlad's entire worldview and set him on a path toward unimaginable cruelty. His father, Vlad II, had been murdered by Wallachian boyars, the very nobles he was supposed to trust and lead, but the worst was yet to come. His older brother, Mircea II, had suffered an even more horrific fate. The boyars had tortured him in ways that defied human decency. They blinded him with red-hot iron stakes, then buried him alive while he was still breathing. The image of his brother, screaming in darkness beneath the earth, would become the fuel for a rage that would consume nations. Imagine being 16 years old and learning that your family, your protectors, your very identity had been butchered by the people they trusted most. For most, such trauma would be crushing. For Vlad, it became the foundation of his character. Trust was weakness. Mercy was stupidity. Only through fear could loyalty be guaranteed. The Ottomans watched their young hostage process this devastating news. They expected him to break, to finally submit to their will. Instead, they witnessed something far more disturbing. Vlad's eyes grew cold, calculating. His rage transformed from hot fury into something much more dangerous, ice-cold determination. While Radu continued to adapt and even flourish in the Ottoman court, Vlad began planning. Not just escape, but something far more ambitious and terrifying. He studied the Ottomans' methods, their strengths, their weaknesses. He learned their language, their customs, their fears. But most importantly, he absorbed their approaches to psychological warfare, their understanding that terror could be more powerful than any army. The other hostage princes saw him as strange, unsettling. He would sit for hours in silence, his mind working through scenarios, strategies, possibilities for revenge. His tutors found him brilliant but disturbing, a young man who seemed to view every lesson in governance as preparation for war. By 1448, when Vlad was finally released from Ottoman captivity, he had been transformed. The frightened 11-year-old boy who had arrived at the Sultan's court was gone, replaced by something harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. His education was complete, but not in the way the Ottomans had intended. They had meant to create a loyal vassal, a puppet ruler who would serve Ottoman interests. Instead, they had forged their most implacable enemy. Every technique they had used to break him, every method of control and intimidation they had demonstrated, had been carefully catalogued in his memory. He would use their own lessons against them, but with refinements that would horrify even his former captors. His family decimated, his birthright stolen, Vlad was left with nothing but a burning obsession, revenge. But how could a teenage political pawn, his life hanging by a thread, ever hope to achieve it against such powerful enemies? He was 16. 16! And for 2 fleeting months in 1448, Vlad Dracula was the ruler of Wallachia. Then, just as suddenly, he wasn't. The Ottomans had installed him as their puppet, expecting easy control over their former hostage. They discovered their mistake almost immediately. Vlad's first acts as prince showed a disturbing independence, a refusal to simply rubber-stamp Ottoman demands. His subjects, meanwhile, saw him as nothing more than a Turkish collaborator, a traitor imposed by their enemies. The boyars who had murdered his father and brother still held real power in Wallachia, and they had no intention of serving a prince they viewed as an Ottoman pawn. Within months, Vlad found himself fleeing for his life, his brief taste of power dissolving like morning mist. But power, he learned, was a slippery beast, easy to lose, but possible to reclaim if you had the stomach for what it required. His next teacher would be John Hunyadi, the legendary White Knight of Wallachia, a man whose hatred for the Ottoman Empire burned as fiercely as Vlad's own. Hunyadi saw something valuable in the young exile, a hatred of the Turks that mirrored his own, combined with intimate knowledge of their methods and weaknesses. Under Hunyadi's mentorship, Vlad learned the arts of war and statecraft from a master, but these weren't gentle lessons in diplomacy and compromise. Hunyadi was a warrior who understood that in the struggle against the Ottomans, conventional rules meant death. He taught Vlad that political survival required absolute ruthlessness, that enemies had to be not just defeated, but utterly destroyed. Hunyadi's approach to warfare was brutal and effective. He showed Vlad how to use terrain as a weapon, how to turn a smaller force into a dagger aimed at an enemy's heart. But most importantly, he demonstrated how psychological warfare could multiply military strength. A terrified enemy was already half defeated before the first battle began. For 8 years, Vlad absorbed these lessons while nursing his growing obsession with reclaiming his throne. He studied every aspect of Wallachian politics, identifying the key players, understanding their motivations and fears. He built networks of supporters, people who shared his vision of an independent Wallachia free from Ottoman control. But studying and planning could only take him so far. By 1456, with Hunyadi's backing, Vlad was ready to make his move. The current prince, Vladislav II, was exactly the kind of weak ruler that Vlad despised, more interested in personal comfort than national independence, willing to compromise with anyone who could guarantee his position. The confrontation between Vlad and Vladislav wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Vladislav represented everything Vlad had come to hate: weakness masquerading as pragmatism, collaboration disguised as diplomacy. When they finally faced each other in single combat, it became a symbol of Vlad's larger struggle against compromise and submission. The battle was swift and decisive. This wasn't just politics, this was vengeance, delivered by his own hand. Vlad's sword found its mark, and Vladislav II died, knowing that his killer was everything he himself had refused to become: uncompromising, ruthless, willing to pay any price for power. Standing over his fallen rival, Vlad felt the weight of the Wallachian crown settle on his head for the second time. But this time was different. He wasn't a teenage puppet installed by foreign masters. He was a man who had earned his throne through blood and determination, who understood exactly what it would take to keep it. The lessons of his first, failed reign weren't lost on him. Popular support was fickle, foreign backing unreliable, and political enemies patient. He needed something more powerful than armies or alliances. He needed a weapon that would make his enemies hesitate before challenging him, that would turn resistance into terror and defiance into submission. His experiences as an Ottoman hostage had shown him the power of fear. His time with Hunyadi had taught him the necessity of absolute ruthlessness. Now, as Prince of Wallachia for the second time, he would combine these lessons into something unprecedented in its scope and horror. The other European rulers viewed his victory with interest but little concern. They saw just another minor Balkan prince claiming a throne that had changed hands dozens of times in recent decades. They had no idea they were witnessing the rise of someone who would redefine the very concept of political terror. Vlad stood over his fallen rival, Wallachia finally his, but the throne was soaked in blood, and the whispers of treachery echoed in every shadow. Keeping it would require more than just courage. It would demand a ruthlessness that would horrify the world. Easter, 1457, a time for forgiveness, for new beginnings. Vlad invited the Wallachian boyars, the nobles who held real power in the kingdom, to a grand feast in Targovishte. They came expecting celebration, fine wine, and the usual political theatre. They found something else entirely. The great hall was magnificent, decorated with tapestries, and filled with the rich aroma of roasted meats. The boyars arrived in their finest clothes, jewels glinting in the candlelight, confident in their traditional privileges and power. These were the men who had spent decades manipulating Wallachian politics, who had murdered princes when it suited them, who viewed rulers as temporary inconveniences to be managed or removed. Vlad played the perfect host, moving among his guests with apparent warmth, ensuring their cups stayed full and their plates remained loaded with delicacies. But those who knew him well might have noticed something unsettling in his eyes, a cold calculation that suggested this feast had a purpose beyond simple hospitality. As the wine flowed and the conversation grew louder, Vlad called for attention. He had a question for his honored guests, he announced with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a simple matter of historical curiosity, really. How many princes of Wallachia had each of them served under during their lifetimes? The question seemed innocent enough, and the boyars were happy to boast about their long experience in statecraft. Some claimed to have served under 7 different rulers, others under 10 or more. They spoke with pride about their ability to adapt, to survive the constant political upheavals that plagued Wallachia. They were professionals, they implied, men who served the institution of the crown regardless of who wore it. Vlad listened to each response with apparent fascination, nodding and asking follow-up questions. But as the answers accumulated, something became clear to the more perceptive guests. This wasn't idle curiosity. This was an investigation, and they were providing evidence for their own prosecution. The room's atmosphere began to shift as the implications sank in. The laughter became forced, the conversations more stilted. Some of the older boyars began to sense danger, but by then it was too late. Vlad's soldiers had quietly positioned themselves throughout the hall, blocking every exit. When Vlad finally revealed his true purpose, his voice remained conversational, almost friendly. These noble boyars, he observed, had demonstrated remarkable longevity in their service to Wallachia. They had served so many different rulers, survived so many political changes. Surely they must possess extraordinary wisdom about loyalty and betrayal. The trap was now fully sprung, and the boyars realized they had walked willingly into their own destruction. Their very boasts about political survival had become confessions of treachery. In Vlad's worldview, shaped by the brutal murder of his father and brother, such adaptability wasn't wisdom, it was complicity in the chaos that had plagued Wallachia for generations. What happened next unfolded with terrifying efficiency. The older boyars, those whose experience stretched back the furthest, were seized immediately. Their screams shattered the festive atmosphere as Vlad's executioners dragged them from the hall. Outside, the stakes were already prepared, sharpened and waiting. The younger nobles faced a different fate, but one equally grim. They were forced into hard labor, building roads and fortifications under brutal conditions. Those who survived the backbreaking work were eventually killed anyway, their usefulness exhausted. Vlad had no intention of allowing any potential threats to survive, regardless of their age or apparent loyalty. The massacre sent shockwaves through Wallachian society. This wasn't the random violence of a madman, but the calculated elimination of an entire power structure. In a single afternoon, Vlad had decapitated the traditional nobility, removing the class of people who had historically determined the fate of Wallachian rulers. The message was seared into the consciousness of everyone who heard about the Easter feast. Traditional privileges meant nothing. Past services offered no protection. Family connections provided no immunity. Only absolute, unquestioning obedience could guarantee survival in Vlad's Wallachia. But the psychological impact went even deeper. By choosing Easter for his massacre, Vlad had committed an act of sacrilege that horrified Christian Europe. He had turned the holiest day of the Christian calendar into a theatre of mass murder, demonstrating that his authority recognized no limits, respected no boundaries, acknowledged no higher power than his own will. The few surviving nobles understood that a new era had begun in Wallachia. The old rules of political survival, flexibility, compromise, the ability to change loyalties when necessary, had become death sentences. Vlad had eliminated not just his enemies, but the very concept of legitimate opposition. The message was seared into the consciousness of Wallachia. Defy Vlad and face an agonizing end. He had crushed internal dissent with horrifying precision. But his quest for order was far from over. It was about to extend into the most personal and disturbing aspects of life. Imagine living under a ruler whose moral code was as sharp and as unforgiving as an executioner's blade. In Vlad's Wallachia, female chastity wasn't just a virtue, it was a matter of life and horrifying, prolonged death. Vlad's obsession with absolute control extended far beyond political matters into the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives. He had witnessed the chaos that he believed came from moral decay, and he was determined to impose his vision of purity through the most brutal means imaginable. Women accused of losing their virginity outside marriage faced punishments that defied human comprehension. The charges often came from spurned lovers, jealous rivals, or neighbors settling personal scores. Vlad's investigators showed no interest in evidence or due process. An accusation was enough. The public nature of these punishments was deliberate. He sought to control not just their bodies, but their very souls, through unspeakable public degradation. The terror wasn't confined to the accused, it spread through entire communities, as people witnessed what happened to those who supposedly violated Vlad's moral code. Married women suspected of adultery faced similar fates, often forced to endure additional torments designed to maximize their psychological suffering. Their alleged partners, when identified, were compelled to witness these spectacles, creating layers of trauma that rippled through families and communities. The pervasive atmosphere of suspicion and terror meant that women lived in constant fear of false accusations. Normal social interactions became dangerous. A conversation with the wrong person, a glance misinterpreted, a moment of privacy misconstrued. Any of these could lead to charges that meant certain death. For Vlad, this wasn't random cruelty but a systematic approach to social engineering. He believed that only through absolute fear could he create the kind of society he envisioned, one where every citizen's behavior aligned perfectly with his personal vision of moral order. His approach to other social problems followed the same brutal logic. When faced with the persistent issue of poverty and begging in his territories, Vlad devised a solution that perfectly encapsulated his mindset. He invited all the beggars, vagrants, and poor people in Wallachia to a great feast in a specially constructed wooden hall. The invitation promised food, shelter, and relief from their suffering. Hundreds of desperate people accepted, grateful for what seemed like unprecedented royal generosity. They filled the hall, enjoying the finest meal of their lives, speaking hopefully about this new prince who seemed to care about their welfare. As the feast reached its peak, Vlad's soldiers appeared at every door and window. They barricaded the exits, trapping everyone inside. Then came the torches. The wooden structure, deliberately designed to burn quickly, became a fiery tomb, a feast that turned into a funeral pyre. His solution to poverty was annihilation disguised as charity. When asked later about this massacre, Vlad reportedly explained his reasoning with chilling logic. These people, he argued, were a burden on society, contributing nothing while consuming resources. By eliminating them, he had solved the problem of poverty permanently, while ensuring that no one in Wallachia would suffer from want again. His approach to international relations followed the same pattern of theatrical brutality designed to send unmistakable messages. When Ottoman envoys arrived at his court and refused to remove their turbans, claiming religious and cultural obligations, Vlad saw an opportunity to demonstrate his authority and utter contempt for Ottoman customs. Rather than simply expelling the envoys or engaging in traditional diplomatic protests, Vlad ordered his executioners to nail the turbans permanently to their skulls. It was a diplomatic incident, resolved with hammers and nails, a message written in blood and bone that travelled back to the Sultan faster than any formal communication. The act served multiple purposes in Vlad's strategic thinking. It demonstrated his absolute refusal to acknowledge Ottoman authority, even in matters of diplomatic protocol. It showed his willingness to violate all conventional rules of international relations. Most importantly, it established him as someone whose responses to perceived slights were so disproportionate and brutal that potential enemies had to recalculate the costs of crossing him. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a comprehensive system of governance through terror. Every aspect of life in Vlad's Wallachia was subject to his personal moral code, enforced through punishments so severe that they paralyzed normal social functioning. People stopped trusting their neighbors, families turned on themselves, and entire communities lived in a state of perpetual anxiety. For Vlad, order meant purity, and purity, it seemed, could only be achieved through suffering that redefined the boundaries of human cruelty. He was sculpting his kingdom through fear, each act of brutality, a chisel blow. But the tool he was becoming most infamous for, impalement, wasn't just a punishment in his hands. He was elevating it to a terrifying art form, a science of suffering. Impalement. The word itself conjures images of unimaginable agony, but for Vlad Dracula, the conventional methods were inefficient. He sought not just death, but a symphony of suffering, prolonged for hours, even days. Traditional impalement, as practiced throughout history, was relatively swift. A sharp stake driven through the body would typically cause rapid death from massive trauma or blood loss. For most practitioners, this was sufficient. The victim died, the example was made, the message was sent. But Vlad saw this as wasteful, a missed opportunity for maximum psychological impact. His innovations began with the stakes themselves. Where others used sharp, pointed implements designed to pierce quickly, Vlad ordered his executioners to use thicker, blunted stakes. These were carefully sanded and lubricated, not out of mercy, but to ensure they would slide into the body without causing immediately fatal damage. The insertion process itself became a gruesome ritual of precision and patience. Rather than driving the stake through quickly, Vlad's executioners worked slowly and methodically. The blunted end would be carefully positioned and gradually forced into the body, usually through the rectum, though other entry points were sometimes used depending on the specific message Vlad wanted to send. The key was avoiding vital organs during the initial insertion. A stake driven too quickly, or at the wrong angle, might pierce the heart, lungs, or major blood vessels, causing rapid death. Vlad's method was designed to avoid these merciful complications. Instead, the stake would be guided along the body's natural cavities and pathways, emerging hours later through the shoulder, neck, or mouth, while leaving the victim conscious and aware throughout the entire ordeal. Imagine the scene, not a swift execution, but a slow, calculated process. The executioner, a craftsman of pain, whose skill was measured not by speed, but by how long he could keep his victim alive and suffering. Some of Vlad's most experienced executioners could ensure that victims remained conscious and vocal for more than 24 hours. The psychological torture was as carefully orchestrated as the physical component. Victims would be forced to watch others undergo the same process before their own turn came. They would hear the screams, witness the prolonged agony, and understand exactly what awaited them. This anticipatory terror often broke people psychologically before the physical torture even began. The positioning of the impaled victims was another crucial element of Vlad's system. Rather than simply leaving them to die in private, he arranged them in public spaces, where their continued suffering served as a constant reminder of his power. Markets, town squares, and roads leading to his territories became galleries of horror where the dying served as living warnings to the living. The sounds were as important as the sights in Vlad's calculated theatre of terror. The moans, screams, and pleas of the impaled created an auditory landscape of fear that penetrated into homes, markets, and places of worship. Even those who avoided looking at the stakes couldn't escape the constant reminder of what defying Vlad's will would bring. Weather became another tool in this prolonged torture. Rain would make the victim's suffering even more acute, while hot sun would accelerate dehydration and add elements of exposure to the experience. Vlad's executioners learned to time their work to maximize these natural contributions to the victim's agony. The medical precision required for these extended impalements meant that Vlad's executioners became grotesquely skilled anatomists. They developed an understanding of human anatomy that allowed them to navigate the body's internal structures while avoiding immediate death. This knowledge, gained through repeated practice on living subjects, made them horrifyingly effective at their craft. The duration of suffering became a point of professional pride among Vlad's executioners. They would compete to see who could keep victims alive longest, developing techniques and refinements that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. What had once been a simple method of execution became a sophisticated system of extended torture. The impact on observers was exactly what Vlad intended. People who witnessed these prolonged executions were fundamentally changed by the experience. The knowledge that such suffering was possible, that it could be deliberately imposed and carefully managed, created a level of terror that went far beyond normal fear of death. Word of these refinements spread far beyond Wallachia's borders, carried by traumatized merchants, fleeing refugees, and horrified diplomats. The mere mention of Vlad's name began to evoke not just fear of military defeat, but terror of unimaginable personal suffering that could last for days. The key was to miss the vital organs, to keep the victim alive, conscious, for as long as inhumanly possible, turning death itself into a weapon of psychological warfare. Vlad had taken a brutal punishment and made it his terrifying signature, a method so horrific it paralyzed his enemies with fear. But where did this monstrous practice originate? Was he a singular monster, or was he merely the most infamous student of a long, dark human tradition? Believe it or not, Vlad Dracula didn't invent impalement, not even close. This particular brand of human cruelty has roots stretching back to the very dawn of civilization. Our journey into this dark history begins in Babylon, around 1700 BC, where humanity's first written legal code included detailed instructions for this horrific punishment. The Code of Hammurabi, carved into stone pillars throughout the Babylonian Empire, specified impalement as the penalty for certain crimes. Law 153 prescribed this punishment for a wife who murdered her husband, though the Babylonian method was typically transversal, a stake driven horizontally through the body, causing relatively quick death compared to what would come later. But it was the Assyrians who truly elevated impalement from simple execution to psychological warfare on a massive scale. King Ashurnasirpal II, ruling in the 9th century BC, transformed impalement into a cornerstone of imperial policy. His approach was longitudinal, stakes inserted through the body's length, designed to maximize suffering and create lasting terror. The Assyrians understood something crucial about human psychology. Terror was a weapon that could defeat armies before they even formed. Ashurnasirpal didn't just punish rebellious subjects. He advertised their suffering through detailed stone carvings that decorated his palaces. These engravings served as both historical records and threats, showing in graphic detail what happened to those who opposed Assyrian rule. The scenes carved into Assyrian palace walls depicted forests of impaled victims, their agony immortalized in stone for eternity. Visiting diplomats and potential enemies would walk through halls lined with these images, understanding without words what rebellion would cost them. It was psychological warfare executed through architectural intimidation. As empires rose and fell, the practice of impalement spread across cultures and continents, adapting to local customs while retaining its essential horror. Medieval Europe saw its own variations, particularly in German territories during the 14th through 16th centuries, where impalement became associated with specific categories of crime. Adulterous couples faced this punishment in some German regions, the method serving both as execution and moral lesson. Women accused of killing their children, often in cases that might today be recognized as postpartum depression or desperate poverty, were impaled through the heart. The symbolic nature of this placement wasn't lost on medieval audiences. The heart that should have protected the child became the site of ultimate punishment. Accused witches faced similar fates, impaled through the heart with wooden stakes in a grotesque parody of the vampire legends that would later incorporate Vlad's name. These executions were public spectacles that reinforced social fears and religious orthodoxy while providing entertainment for crowds who had few other diversions. The Assyrians understood something crucial. Terror was a weapon, and public agony its sharpest edge, capable of maintaining order through the mere threat of unendurable suffering. The persistence of impalement through different eras and cultures reveals something disturbing about human nature. Even after Vlad's death, the practice continued across the world. In 17th century Egypt, French traveller Jean de Thévenot recorded witnessing impalements where victims remained conscious and speaking for hours after the stakes were inserted. The Dutch colonial administration in 18th century Suriname used a variation involving metal hooks driven through the ribs, leaving rebels hanging in public squares as warnings to other potential insurgents. The Ottoman Empire, despite being one of Vlad's primary targets, continued practicing impalement well into the 1830s for certain military crimes. Even in the 20th century, impalement found new expressions of horror. During World War II, Japanese forces in occupied territories used sharpened bamboo stakes in torture sessions, adapting ancient techniques to modern warfare's psychological components. The global nature of impalement's history reveals it as more than just one culture's aberration. From ancient Mesopotamia to medieval Europe, from Islamic empires to modern dictatorships, the practice emerged independently across human societies, suggesting something troubling about our species' capacity for systematized cruelty. Each culture developed its own refinements and variations, but the core concept remained constant: the transformation of death from a private experience into a public spectacle designed to terrorize observers. The method's effectiveness lay not just in eliminating enemies, but in creating lasting psychological trauma among survivors. The technical knowledge required for effective impalement meant that specialized executioners developed expertise passed down through generations. These craftsmen of suffering refined their techniques across centuries, creating traditions of horror that transcended individual rulers or specific conflicts. Impalement, then, was no isolated horror. It was a dark thread woven through the tapestry of human history. Vlad, for all his monstrous ingenuity, was merely perfecting an ancient craft. And now, armed with this ancestral terror and his own refinements, he was about to provoke the most powerful empire on earth into a war that would define his legend. Late 1461. While the Ottoman Empire basked in its power, Vlad Dracula did the unthinkable. He didn't wait to be attacked. He crossed the Danube. He took the war to them. Sultan Mehmed II had grown accustomed to enemies who waited trembling behind their fortifications, hoping against hope that the Ottoman juggernaut might pass them by. Vlad represented something entirely different, a ruler who believed that the best defense was the most audacious possible offense, even when facing impossible odds. The invasion began as a series of lightning raids across Ottoman territories south of the Danube, but these weren't typical military operations designed to capture territory or resources. They were campaigns of systematic extermination, calculated to send a message that would reach the Sultan's court in Constantinople. Over 2 weeks in late 1461, Vlad's forces swept through a 500-mile swath of Ottoman territory, leaving behind scenes that horrified even seasoned soldiers. His own boastful letter to Matthias Corvinus claimed the death toll at 23,884 Turks, men, women, and children eliminated not just as military targets, but as symbols of Ottoman presence in the region. He wasn't just fighting, he was exterminating, and he wanted the world to know. The letter he sent to Allied courts described the carnage in terms designed to maximize political impact, portraying himself as Christianity's most ruthless defender against Islamic expansion. But Vlad understood that his small force of roughly 30,000 men could never match the Ottoman Empire in conventional warfare. When Mehmed II responded by assembling a massive army of 150,000 troops, Vlad had to completely reimagine the nature of military conflict. His strategy was to turn Wallachia itself into a weapon. As the Ottoman army advanced, they found a landscape stripped of everything useful. Wells had been poisoned with corpses and refuse. Crops had been burned in the fields. Livestock had been slaughtered or driven away. Every settlement had been evacuated, leaving behind only empty buildings that might conceal deadly traps. This scorched earth approach went far beyond typical defensive measures. Vlad was deliberately making his own territory uninhabitable, sacrificing his people's immediate welfare for long-term strategic advantage. The advancing Ottoman army found themselves in a hostile landscape that offered no sustenance, no shelter, and no respite from constant harassment. The psychological warfare was equally systematic. Vlad sent individuals infected with plague and other diseases into Ottoman camps, using epidemic illness as a weapon of war centuries before biological warfare became a recognized military concept. The fear of disease, combined with the constant threat of ambush and the absence of reliable supplies, began to break down Ottoman morale. But Vlad's most audacious move came on the night of June 17, 1462. Intelligence reports had located Sultan Mehmed II's position within the vast Ottoman camp. Rather than attempting a conventional battle he couldn't win, Vlad decided on something unprecedented, a personal assassination mission aimed at the heart of the Ottoman command structure. Leading a small force of his most trusted soldiers, Vlad infiltrated the Ottoman camp under cover of darkness. This wasn't just military strategy, it was personal vendetta, elevated to the level of international warfare. The boy who had been held hostage in Ottoman courts was now hunting the Sultan himself in his own tent. The raid very nearly succeeded. Vlad's forces penetrated deep into the Ottoman camp, creating chaos and panic among troops who had thought themselves safely beyond enemy reach. The Sultan's personal guards were caught completely off guard by an attack that violated every conventional rule of military engagement. Though the assassination attempt ultimately failed, Vlad's forces attacked the wrong tent in the darkness and confusion. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine the scene. Vlad himself, a phantom in the night, deep within the heart of the Ottoman war machine, close enough to the Sultan to smell his fear. Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the terror of Christian Europe, found himself personally threatened by an enemy who seemed to acknowledge no boundaries, respect no conventions, and fear no odds. The Sultan, a man used to conquest, found himself bogged down in a land that seemed to actively despise him. The raid's failure to kill Mehmed didn't diminish its strategic success. Word spread throughout the Ottoman ranks that their enemy was capable of anything, that no position was secure, that Vlad himself might appear anywhere at any moment. The psychological advantage gained from this single night's work was worth more than any conventional military victory. Vlad had thrown everything at the Ottoman behemoth, raids, disease, terror. He had even tried to cut off its head. But Mehmed's army, though shaken, was still immense, still advancing. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, Vlad had one final ghastly card to play. As the Sultan's forces marched on Targovishte, they were about to witness an exhibition of horror so profound it would be remembered for centuries. The scouts' reports made no sense. A forest, they stammered, but not of trees. As Sultan Mehmed II's massive army crested the final hill before Targovishte, the true scope of Vlad's final message became horribly clear. Stretching across the fields for miles, arranged in perfect, ghastly rows, stood 20,000 impaled corpses, men, women, children, an entire population transformed into a monument to terror. The Forest of the Dead was Vlad's masterpiece of psychological warfare. Each stake had been precisely positioned, creating geometric patterns visible from great distances. The bodies were at different stages of decay, suggesting that the impalement had taken place over weeks or months, a systematic process of turning human beings into components of a vast, macabre display. Even Mehmed II, who had witnessed the fall of Constantinople and countless other scenes of warfare, was reported to have gone pale at the sight. His horse refused to advance further, as if the animal itself could sense the wrongness of what lay ahead. The Sultan's war council fell silent, unable to process the scale of what they were witnessing. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was discovered when they moved closer. Birds had built nests in some of the corpses, treating the impaled bodies as just another part of the landscape. Nature itself had adapted to Vlad's horror, incorporating the dead into the cycle of life, in ways that made the scene even more surreal and nightmarish. Mehmed reportedly made a statement that became legendary. It is not possible to deprive such a man of his country. The Sultan, who had conquered the greatest city in Europe, who commanded armies that could reshape nations, was admitting defeat to a force of 30,000, led by a man he had once held as a hostage. The Ottoman army withdrew, not because they couldn't defeat Vlad militarily, but because they couldn't psychologically process the implications of fighting someone capable of such calculated horror. The Forest of the Dead had achieved what no conventional army could. It had made the mighty Ottoman Empire retreat through pure terror. But Vlad's psychological victory came at a devastating personal cost. His wife, witnessing Ottoman forces approaching the castle and fearing capture, chose to leap from the tower rather than face whatever torments awaited her. Her suicide shattered something fundamental in Vlad, removing one of the few human connections that had anchored his increasingly unstable mind. His brother Radu, now leading Ottoman-backed forces, besieged Vlad's remaining strongholds. The irony was perfect and tragic. The brother who had adapted to Ottoman captivity was now the instrument of the brother who had resisted it. Political necessity had completed the destruction of their family that had begun with their father's murder. When Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus, supposedly Vlad's ally, betrayed and imprisoned him, Vlad's active reign ended. 12 years in Hungarian dungeons followed, years that broke many prisoners but seemed only to concentrate Vlad's essential nature. When he was finally released and briefly restored to the Wallachian throne, he lasted only months before dying in battle. His head was sent to Mehmed II in Constantinople, displayed on a spike, the ultimate irony for the man who had made such displays his signature. But death couldn't contain Vlad's impact on history and imagination. Today, in parts of Romania, Vlad Dracula is remembered not as a monster, but as a patriotic hero who defended Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion. The man who created forests of human suffering is celebrated in statues and monuments, his methods forgotten while his resistance is lionized. A monster to many, a savior to some, the Impaler's shadow stretches long, forcing us to ask, what defines a hero and what defines a monster?